Hey guys, Dominic here. In this video I'll be taking a look at the Radial Sweep tool in Modo. You'll find it on the Duplicate tab. In the viewport you see some examples of what I have already done. This is a radial sweep started from a curve. This is a radial sweep started from some polygons. And this is a radial sweep started from nothing, but via selecting a profile. I'll show you that later on. So let's see this in action. I'm going to hide this one, this one, this one, and this one, and this one, and going to a selection of polygons. So right now I have 4 polys. And when I go to the Duplicate tab and select Radial Sweep and click in the viewport to activate the tool, you'll see you have this. But I think, yep, I had a profile selected. I'm going to Control click on it to deselect it to go to my original sweep. And there are several things going on right now. You see this blue line, dotted line with some icons. You can interactively click on them. This sets, when you see over here, you see the axis change when I do this. First of all, I'm going to set it back to 0. When setting all these axes to 0, you see that Z does not go to 0. Why? Well, one of these numbers always has to have a value greater than 0. For instance, when I set my axis to Z, now you can see here the profile, the sweep is aligned to the Z axis. When I set it to X, Shift A to frame, it's aligned on the X axis, and when I set it to Y, it's on the Y axis. Now starting from those polygons like I did earlier, when you sweep it on Y, you often get a very flat sweep. So usually do something like that on the Z or on the X axis. The other icons you see here control start and end angle. When I hover over it, it highlights yellow, and when I click and drag, it's not working out very well at the moment. You see that's my end angle. You can see it over here. The end angle is changing, and over here I also should have an icon for my start angle. Maybe I should, yeah, right now it's in the same place. You see, when I hover over the square here, the square highlights. When I hover over the line here, the line highlights. And I'm going to drag it out of there because sometimes difficult to select these two. This one controls my start angle. So again, over here you see start angle. When I click and drag this, it zoom out a bit. It doesn't always work very well. Maybe it's like that. So don't actually know whether I have to move my mouse up and down or left or right. It's a bit of diagonally seems to work out best. Anyway, my start angle, you can set it over here, and the end angle again you can set that over there. I'm going to set it to 360, and now I only have one complete revolve. So maybe this will be a bit confusing, all of that, so I'm going to go over these options one by one. So the radial sweep sorry, radial sweep creates geometry, obviously, and it's useful for things like bottles, plates or goblets, and even springs. And it does that by revolving geometry, a geometry selection around a central point. As we'll see later, you don't actually have to have geometry or a curve. in your scene, but I'll show you that later. So you can start from a curve, you can start from a polygon. I'll show you later you can start also from nothing. And closed shapes like a cube or a sphere, those are most of the time not good starting points. So you start best from a curve or a polygon. Then we have the Helix Generator. You see that over there. The count is the number of segments. I will show you. When you zoom in, you have segments. You see over here. Right now it's set to 120. Now I only have one revolve going from start angle 0 to end angle 360. But when I, for instance, would set this to 2 revolves to 720 degrees, now I have 2 revolves, it's still 120 segments, but divided over them 2 revolves. So, for instance, if I were to say 7200, now I have 20 revolves. Now you see that the number of segments, that the polys are much larger, because there are 20 revolves and I only have 120 segments. So I could say, well, for instance, 360, and now the spiral is much smoother. Again, then the axis to sweep the geometry. When you set it to Z, it will be in the Z direction. When you set it to X, it will be in the X direction. When you set it to Y, it will be in the Y direction. I'm gonna leave it at Z for now. As I showed earlier, you can drag these icons for the start angle and the end angle. It's not, I'm going to zoom in on this. Here you have a little blue line. When you hover over it, it becomes yellow. When you click and drag, you can set it interactively for the end angle. I prefer to set them numerically over here in the options. Works better for me. But you can also drag these angles. These are always opposites of one another. What do I mean? For instance, when I set the axis XYZ, I'm gonna check this icon to set them all to 1. Now you see this blue cube or square, when I hover over it, it highlights yellow. Now that is set to 1, 1, 1 in space, and that means that this one will be at -1 in X, in -1 in Y, and -1 in Z. Not too important, I think. I always leave it at 0, and as I said earlier, I think one of them will stay positive, because if I could set this to 0, this would mean that this would go to 0, and then I wouldn't have a sweep. Maybe all of that sounds confusing. I suggest you experiment a bit with it. Another important icon over here is that crosshair. That one controls the action center of the 3D. I can also drag it interactively, and this will change the way my geometry looks. I find it a good way to interactively set how my object will look like. Of course, if you want to adjust the thickness of this sweep, then that is something you will have to experiment with your original geometry. Remember, I started off from these 4 polygons. If you make them bigger, then of course, or when you make them wider, then of course the tube or the spiral will be wider. Let's see. So the axis was the axis to sweep the geometry. Axis X, Y, Z, that's also something that I just showed you. The start angle I've showed you, end angle. The offsets, important one. Right now the axis is set to 20 meters. This means that this is the offset in the direction that the sweep will go to. When I set it to 1, you will see it becomes very short. When I set it to 5, it becomes longer. When I set it to 10, so this controls or moves successive segments, and this is useful when the end angle is greater than 360 degrees. When the end angle is 360 degrees, you see it also has an effect, but it's most obvious when you set it to, for instance, 1800 degrees, and now when I change the offset, the geometry becomes longer or shorter. I'm gonna leave it at 10, and this was 3600 degrees. What else? The sweep effector, sweep UVs. The sweep UVs option that we will find here, you can set it to none, U or V, determines along which UV axis to span the newly created geometry. It's useful for when you are sorry about that. Okay, I'm back, sorry about that. So useful when you are UV mapping, of course. Invert polygons, also important. Over here you have an option to invert your polygons. Sometimes when you start a sweep on a certain axis, your polys are flipped inside out, and with this setting you can say I want to invert. With cap start and cap end, you can choose whether you want the start and the end to be capped or not. Very straightforward. Profile attributes, I'm going to leave that for later on. Right, you can set a profile, but for creating a radial sweep from starting from geometry like I did, I haven't experimented if I can set a profile with it. Let's see, maybe I can, but I don't know if that will be very useful if you start from geometry. I don't think so, but I show that later on. Snapping options, it's a separate subject, and the action center auto 3D, that's the placement of this icon. As you see, when I drag this, you can see over here that the values are changing. Z value in this instance is not changing. Why? This is because the axis is Z at this moment. So when I move it in Z, then you don't see a change. You see a bit of a change because when I'm moving it interactively, it also changes a bit on X and Y, on the Y axis. But if you were to move it only in Z, it doesn't make a difference because my axis is Z. But when I move it up and down, or better like this, then you see it does have great impact for how I can move it. It's a great way to move this interactively. Okay, so this is the radial sweep when starting from geometry like a polygon. But I can also start from a curve. I have a curve here with a simple curve with 4 points. Back to shaded mode. Now when I select my radial sweep and click in the viewport, you see it starts from the curve, and I can create very interesting effects like that. The settings of the radial sweep are the same as I did before, so I could set, for instance, to 240 on the x-axis. Right now, because this is started from a curve, this is not a closed geometry, so you have to turn your viewport around or flip your polygons. The offset is a bit low, maybe 20, so you can see that it's an open geometry. End angle, so the amount of revolves I want. When it's 3600, it's 10 revolves. When it's for instance 720, I only have 2 revolves. All the rest actually is the same as when you start from actual geometry. I can move this around. This is my action center, same as before. Start this is the start angle. Yep, start angle. This one is the end angle. You can drag that interactively. So this is the radial sweep started from a curve. And as I told you earlier, I can also start from nothing. So here I have a mesh layer which contains no geometry. Now when I click my radial sweep, I'm going to reset the tool. So I went to the pipeline, right click and set reset tool. Now when I click in the viewport, I get a radial sweep, but there is no geometry because there was no geometry to start with. But I can set a profile. I can, for instance, choose this profile, and now I have geometry. So you don't have to start from a curve or from a polygon. You simply can start the radial sweep and then choose a profile, and then I have some profile attributes that I can change. The size I can set, for instance, 2 meters instead of 1.5. Again, over here I have my start angle and my end angle. I can change my action center, which will have an impact. Going to set the size to 2, maybe 1.5. Curve subdivision tolerance. That's the minimum height when it subdivides Bezier curve to polyline. Haven't experimented with it one yet. It's maybe something you can experiment with. Pivot. That you see here, you can set different pivot positions for the profile. Origin. Everything has gone. Left top, left center, and so on. I usually just leave it at center. Again, I can invert my polygons, then I get a different kind of sweep. Another important element, reverse X and Y. Reverse the selected profile to horizontal or vertical. This also can have an effect on what you want to do. So if I were to say reverse X and maybe invert polygons along with that, now I have reversed the geometry. So I'm going to undo that. Reverse X, invert polygons. So now I think it shifts the geometry to the other side. It's not the same as inverting my polygons, but if I invert and reverse, then now this is the top side, if you will, and invert polygons, reverse X, and now this is the top side of how you want your profile, which side you want it to point. Reverse Y doesn't do very much in this case. So I think I've covered most of what I wanted to cover. I hope you find this useful. It's something you will have to experiment with, but basically if you try some different stuff like I just did and move the handles around, see what happens, then most of it should be pretty straightforward on how to use the radial sweep. Okay, bye for now. This was Dominic.